These are the decisions that shook the world. It is 1963, and black Americans are struggling against the racial injustice and widespread violence inflicted upon them. Their outcry has led President John F. Kennedy to propose a sweeping new civil rights bill. On November 22, 1963, the president's vision of the future, including his hope to end segregation, is about to be crushed. The nation is stunned, and the fate of Kennedy's civil rights bill is now in the hands of a former senator from Texas.
This is a sad time for all people. I will do my best. That is all I can do. I ask for your help.
At the end of that terrible day, as Lyndon Johnson returns to his residence, he knows he must make a crucial decision that will affect his entire presidency and the nation he must now lead.
He lay in his pajamas in this vast bed. We watched television till about 4 in the morning. The commentators all over the world were inspecting this alien cowboy who was now the leader of the free world. Here's a man who was president for only 12 hours, and because of his 24 years in the Congress and as vice president, had observed what presidents did right and what they did wrong. And he meant to use that catalog of experience to let him be, as he said, the greatest American president that he could be.
I didn't know quite what to expect of Lyndon Johnson. I knew he was from Texas, Southerner. I had some reservations and maybe misgivings about him just because of his history.
President Lyndon Johnson is faced with a dilemma. Civil rights is the nation's biggest domestic issue, but to take further action could set off a political firestorm, especially in the South.
Kennedy in 1960 had given the impression when he was running for president that he would be, if elected, a great civil rights president. He said, if I'm elected, I'm going to end discrimination against black Americans with a stroke of the pen.
But by 1963, Kennedy had done little to end segregation. He didn't want to alienate white Southern politicians who had been firmly opposed to granting civil rights to blacks, politicians he needed for his other programs.
Both white and colored cannot be permitted to live and work in peace and harmony as we all want to do.
Only by the summer of 1963 did Kennedy really act.
The fires of frustration and discord are burning in every city. Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it is not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
The proposed civil rights bill would make it illegal for public places such as restaurants, hotels, and movie theaters to ban black customers.
Lord is on our side. Lord is on our side. The farmer in the dale, hi-yo, the berry-o, the farmer in the dale.
I'm sorry, I did not choose to sell your ticket.
You do not choose to sell me a ticket? Is this because of my race?
No comment.
No comment.
Can I be admitted?
No, sir, you cannot be admitted.
Why?
I am not going to serve you.
Because of my race?
I'm not going to serve you.
Because of my race.
Move on.
But in the wake of his speech, Kennedy's popularity dropped, and the violence against blacks continued.
Civil rights was possible, and not just possible, it was needed by the country. Hundreds of people had protested in every way. They'd been met by brutality. Hoses turned on them, buses set afire, some people killed.
Kennedy's civil rights bill had been languishing, locked up in the Senate. President Kennedy was unable to spring it loose.
I heard it on the radio that the President of the United States had been assassinated. I was shocked. I was concerned, like many of us, that with the loss of President Kennedy and now Lyndon Johnson as president, this will interrupt the movement toward equality and justice.
I don't think anybody could have been sure with Kennedy's assassination what Johnson would do. His previous attitudes in the Senate from the time he first came there was one of accommodating the racial inclinations of his strongest supporters in Texas. And his public statements were very negative about civil rights.
The northern white person makes often an intellectual change. But for a person who is a Southerner, who grew up in the kind of climate that Lyndon Johnson did, has to make not only an intellectual change, but an emotional change.
I've always had a notion that I would rather have a converted Southerner on my side than a wobbly Northern liberal.
Johnson knew all of the black leaders at the time, Roy Wilkins and Dr. Martin Luther King, Dorothy Height. He knew them all. And I think at first there was a lack of trust. But later on, they began to realize that this man was made of steel.
The evening of his second day in office, President Johnson receives a phone call from a concerned Martin Luther King.
I think one of the great tributes that we can pay in memory of President Kennedy is to try to enact some of the great progressive policies that he sought to initiate.
Well, I'm going to support them all, and you can count on that, and I'm going to do my best to get other men to do likewise, and I'll have to have y'all's help. I never needed more than I do now.
Well, you know you have it, and just feel free to call on us for anything.
Thank you so much, Martin.
For Johnson, it was almost like the devil on one side and the angel on the other. The angel was saying, you have the chance to do more for civil rights than any president in history. The devil was saying, don't throw it away, Lyndon. You know, be cautious. Don't do something that's not only going to get you in trouble, but may cause you to be defeated when you have to run for election in 1964.
I took an oath, Johnson would later say. But for millions of Americans, I was still illegitimate, a naked man with no presidential covering, a pretender to the throne, an illegal usurper.
He knew that he was into office as a white Southerner. A lot of people were very suspicious. He looked back on his record, and he was running for the Senate from Texas, and in certain ways, you know, was fairly liberal. But on civil rights, he gives these speeches that are essentially white supremacist speeches.
When running for Congress in 1948, Johnson had told his constituents the civil rights program was a farce and a sham, an effort to set up a police state in the guise of liberty. I am opposed to that program.
Where Johnson came from, the Southern roots were deep and abiding. So he understood with great clarity the dangers, the electoral dangers of being out in front on a civil rights bill. President Johnson knew with unerring instinct that to fight for human justice and civil rights in America would mark him as a candidate for defeat. He understood how the South worked, its beliefs, its culture. He was a Southerner.
His experience as a Southerner meant that he probably felt it and realized it about the civil rights issues and about segregation, about the treatment of people, especially in the South. He knew exactly what was happening.
I've heard President Johnson tell racial stories, and I've heard him talk like a Southerner. But the Southern senators were his friends, and it seems to me quite natural that he would talk to them in a way that would try to separate himself from civil rights liberals.
Neither segregationists nor civil rights leaders could be sure about the new president's position on civil rights. But Johnson makes his tough call just 5 days after Kennedy's death in a stirring speech to Congress.
No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long.
Johnson has made his decision.
I remember that speech, and I remember the words of President Johnson. That was very reassuring.
If President Johnson hadn't immediately endorsed the Civil Rights Bill that Kennedy had put in and made a big deal out of it, I think he would have lost a good deal of support. He would have regained the South, which would have helped him in terms of renomination as president. Well, I think he was taking a risk either way.
Washington feels the impact of his announcement immediately. Johnson goes to work on Congress, using his political muscle to get the Civil Rights Bill passed. He knows his strong stance has angered many of his Southern friends in the Senate, friends whose support he will need in the coming election of 1964.
Johnson was very conscious of the fact that one thing he could do in history was to be the president that got Southerners nervous about civil rights to accept civil rights. And one way he felt he could do that, especially in private, was to use the N-word, which was sort of a way of showing, I haven't changed that much, don't think I'm a turncoat.
I heard him say to Paul Douglas, Paul, well, we're going to get the Civil Rights Bill up at 2 o'clock, and I want you to be there. And Johnson walked down and turned the corner, and there was Sam Ervin of North Carolina on the phone. Johnson rapped on the phone booth, Sam, we're going to get the nigger bill up at 2 o'clock.
At the time, Senator Richard Russell of Georgia is just about the most powerful person in the Senate, and he's dead set against the Civil Rights Bill.
We are not yet ready to surrender in our opposition to this bill, which we feel is a perversion of the American way of life.
With great affection, and the President grabbed Russell by the shoulder and he says, Dick, I love you and I owe you. If you hadn't made me leader, I would never have become vice president. If I hadn't been vice president, I wouldn't be sitting where I am today. So all that I am, I owe you, which is why I want to tell you, don't get in my way on this civil rights bill or I'll run you down. And I remember Russell, in those rolling accents of his Georgia countryside, said, well, Mr. President, he said, you may very well do that. But if you do, you're not only going to lose the election, you're going to lose the South forever. As Johnson said in another soft voice, Dick, if that's the price I've got to pay, I'll gladly pay it.
The key to the bill was the Republican leader, Everett Dirksen of Illinois. He went to Dirksen and said, Ev, I know you've got some doubts about the Civil Rights Bill, but look at it this way. 100 years from now, if you're for this bill, Americans will know only two names, Abraham Lincoln and Everett Dirksen. And Dirksen, being a bottomless well for flattery, liked what he heard, supported the bill. However, probably not too many kids these days know the name of Everett Dirksen.
Johnson had a rich appreciation of human foibles. He just delighted in talking to people who sounded highly moral and were living a salacious life off stage.
One particular senator is on the floor trying to block the Civil Rights Bill with a filibuster.
Humphrey told Johnson a senator was doing this, and Johnson said, my God, that guy's got a Negro mistress. How can he do that? And Humphrey said he had no idea that he had a mistress of any kind.
Johnson orders that a call be made to the woman in question.
And a few minutes later, the phone rings in the Democratic cloakroom. The senator gets on the phone. Humphrey's positioned to listen to him, and he hears this guy saying, yes, dear, no, 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 but I'm... And then finally saying, I didn't know it meant that much to you. And then walking back on the floor and attacking the people who were against the bill and saying that now he understood it, he was going to vote to break the filibuster.
It's the day of decision on Capitol Hill as the U.S. Senate clears the way for the Civil Rights Bill by voting to limit debate on the measure. GOP leader Everett Dirksen left and Democratic whip Hugh Humphrey mustered 4 votes more than the necessary majority.
I think the key to Johnson being so driven was, after his serious heart attack in 1955, Johnson always assumed that he would die before the age of 65. So when he was working for a civil rights bill, in his brain was, I'd better do it today because I might die tomorrow.
This is my 9th anniversary of my heart attack today.
Johnson pushes through this major step on the road to racial equality. With Martin Luther King at his side, he signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
When you look back from emancipation to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a long time. So there was no way that you could do anything but rejoice and really feel that we'd hit a landmark.
Even as he was luxuriating in the passage of the Civil Rights Bill, what was really on his mind inside was, oh my God, what is this going to do to me?
He had to assume that it was going to hurt politically. I mean, the civil rights was not a popular issue with the vast majority of people. And indeed, on the night that he signed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, he said to Moyers, we're turning the South over to the Republican Party for my lifetime and yours.
He wanted to get some credit for civil rights. He didn't want it all to go to President Kennedy or to Bobby Kennedy. And obviously voting was the way in which the civil rights leaders were thinking.
Now Johnson has another tough call to make. Civil rights leaders are pressuring him to support a voting rights bill. But he knows the timing is bad. Any further civil rights legislation could jeopardize his chances in the upcoming November elections.
Ooh, yeah.
Before the 1964 presidential elections, hundreds of volunteers, white and black, traveled to Mississippi to help register black voters. It would later become known as Freedom Summer.
Most likely a cop won't try to chunk you in here, but he will hit you across here. You can generally take those licks.
Blacks were legally able to vote, but in many places in the country, when they got to the polling place, they would be given tests on Chaucer, on arcane examples of 14th century English law, things that no one could possibly pass.
In Alabama, in Georgia, in Mississippi, you had to pass a so-called literacy test. On one occasion, a man was asked to give the number of bubbles in a bar of soap.
Despite the efforts of civil rights workers, not enough new black voters are registered to have an impact on the presidential election. At the same time, many Southern white Democrats are leaving the party because of Johnson's strong support of civil rights.
Johnson's opponent would be Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona. Goldwater said, you know, I'm not against civil rights, but I think this bill, the Civil Rights Bill, is unconstitutional. People got the message, especially in the white South, and Johnson was agonized to see that in his home region, very quickly in the polls, Goldwater was getting about 80% to Johnson's 20%.
Johnson wins the election by a landslide, but it's clear he's lost voters in the South, a fact noted by black leaders.
Of course, he gave up all four southern states, deep South states, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. He didn't carry. Goldwater did, plus Arizona. But there was no doubt in our minds that this was the turning point in democratic affairs throughout the South.
Martin Luther King Jr., he had a conversation with President Johnson, and he said, we need a voting rights act.
Johnson says, well, I'm for voting rights, but this ain't the time.
But civil rights leaders don't want to wait. In the spring of 1965, they pressure Johnson to act, staging a nonviolent march in the little-known town of Selma, Alabama.
In Selma, Alabama, in 1965, only 2.1% of blacks of voting age were registered to vote. So on Sunday, March 7, 1965, about 600 of us held a nonviolent workshop. We lined up in twos to walk from Selma to Montgomery to dramatize to the nation that people of color wanted to register to vote. We came to the apex of the Edmund Pettus Bridge, crossing the Alabama River. On the other side, you saw a sea of blue, Alabama state troopers. We continued to walk without anyone saying a word. We get within hearing distance of the state troopers. A man identified himself and said, I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march. You will not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your church. In about a minute and a half, Major John Cloud said, troopers advance.
Advance toward the group. See that they turn around and disperse.
You saw these men putting on their gas. They came toward us. beating us with nightsticks and bullwhips, shrimping us with horses, releasing the tear gas. I was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. And had a concussion there at the bridge. I thought I was going to die.
A lot of white Americans were on the fence on civil rights. Then they saw those pictures on television from Selma. That was something new and horrible. It converted a lot of Americans.
Johnson clearly saw that march as something that would help him get the Voting Rights Act passed.
Johnson calls Congress to an extraordinary nighttime session, demanding that they pass his voting rights bill. And for the first time in history, an American president speaks the credo of the civil rights movement.
I will never, ever forget that speech. Lyndon Johnson spoke to a joint session of the Congress as he spoke to the nation. He started that speech off that night by saying, "I speak tonight for the dignity of man and for the
destiny of democracy." At times, history and fate meet at a single time, in a single place, to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. So it was last week in Selma, Alabama. The harsh fact is that in many places in this country, men and women are kept from voting simply because they're Negroes. Their cause must be our cause too, because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
The hair on the back of my neck still stands straight when I think about that. His mood after that speech was exultant. I mean, you know, I think great politicians are like great actors. They know when they've given a great performance. And he felt it, because to be in that chamber and to feel what was going on, they moved through that hall like a twanging wire, an excitement.
I was sitting with Martin Luther King Jr. in the home of a local family in Selma when we heard Lyndon Johnson say, "And we shall overcome." We knew then that we would make it from Selma to Montgomery, and we knew then that the Voting Rights Act would be passed and signed into law by Lyndon Johnson.
The Voting Rights Act is passed, and exuberant Johnson flies home to Texas.
It was an enormous high. He not only passed voting rights, we just signed Medicare. Oh, I mean, I think he thought this would be one of the things that would mark his reputation in history forever. He wanted to be the education president, the health president, but most of all, he wanted to be the civil rights president.
Johnson would have been unnatural if he hadn't expected to be the beloved figure of African Americans.
One way Johnson was walking on air. There he was down at the ranch. He had passed a lot of the Great Society, and especially this voting rights bill. He thought that he now had the chance to be another Abraham Lincoln, another Franklin Roosevelt. But always with Johnson, there was this nagging worry that something would happen to ruin it all. And within a week, something did.
By late 1966, Johnson's bold civil rights agenda is beginning to be overshadowed by events overseas. More and more American soldiers are dying in a small Southeast Asian country few Americans have even heard of, Vietnam.
Hundreds of thousands of young Americans being sent there, a disproportionate number of those young Americans were black.
We began to witness the drafting of many, many young people. And here at home, people were still suffering from poverty, from hunger. In the heart of the Deep South, we felt somehow in some way that it was contradictory to have people to go abroad to fight for the right to vote, the right to participate, or self-determination in Vietnam. And here at home, there was still scars and stains of racism.
Vietnam, of course, was a seedbed from which sprung all this discontent and torment that was torture in the land.
We've got to build so much strength inside our community so that when LBJ says, "Come here, boy," to my war, we say, "Hell no, we ain't going."
A nation that can spend $35 billion a year on an immoral, ill-considered war in Vietnam and $20 billion to put a man on the moon can suddenly spend billions of dollars to put God's children on their own 2 feet right here on earth.
It forced Dr. King to say that he appreciated the position of the president, but he could not butcher his conscience, that he had to speak out against the war in Vietnam. And the administration had very little to do with him from then on.
It was the black leadership that really got him. I think things that stung were, why didn't the black leadership appreciate what he was doing more? Why aren't they registering more voters? Why did Martin Luther King come out against the war? And he said, my God, these people, you know, they can now eat anywhere they want to eat. They can file employment discrimination suits. We have voting rights for them. Why don't they thank me for them?
As the quagmire in Vietnam deepens, the nation faces further violence at home. Frustration in poor black neighborhoods mounts, and cities across the country are erupting in riots.
First, we have the riots in Detroit, where several people were killed, and then we had riots in Newark. And now we knew we had this massive problem of black discontent, black sense that there was light at the end of the tunnel, but they weren't getting the light fast enough. I mean, all of the things that Johnson was worried about were beginning to happen.
Johnson had always dreamt of being president, but by now the presidency for him was a living hell. The city's in flames, campuses irate about the war in Vietnam. I think privately he probably came to the conclusion, if I serve another term, it's going to kill me.
Facing opposition within his own party and feeling betrayed by those he sought to help, Johnson is forced to make the most painful decision of his political career. On the last day of March 1968, he appears on national television.
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Johnson said privately, you know, Congress and I are just like an old married couple. We've been rubbing up against each other for 40 years, and it isn't happening anymore. As bad as things may have seemed to Johnson on the night he renounced the presidency, 4 days later, it got an awful lot worse.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
The dream of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has not died with him. Men who are white, men who are black, must and will now join together as never in the past.
With less than a year remaining in his presidency, Johnson is again faced with violence in the streets. Across America, riots erupt in reaction to the assassination.
He was terribly worried that this would really tear the country apart. You could stand on the north portico of the White House looking out over Lafayette Park and to the right, and you could see the smoke and the light in the sky from the flames on 14th Street. The other thing to remember about Johnson, in the worst situations, he never lost a sense of humor. One night I brought him this message saying that Stokely Carmichael, the firebrand, black revolutionary, was on the corner of 14th and U Streets in the black section of Washington. Carmichael was organizing a mob to march on Georgetown and burn it down. And Georgetown was where all the columnists and TV commentators and Washington Post editors lived. And Johnson took this message, read it aloud, and said, "I've waited 35 years for this night."
Johnson always knew how to use these moments, and even though all these cities were aflame, he was able to say, this is the moment to do something about fair housing, took the bill out of mothballs.
We've been trying to pass fair housing for 2 years, since 1966. And 2 days after King was assassinated, he said to me, "We're going to get the fair housing bill. I'm going to go to Speaker McCormick. We'll at least get something out of this assassination."
Johnson refuses to give up. On April 11, 1968, his Fair Housing Act is passed.
I do not exaggerate when I say that the proudest moments of my presidency have been times such as this.
But the victory is bittersweet. It is Johnson's last piece of civil rights legislation. Republican Richard Nixon is elected the next president of the United States. And Lyndon Johnson leaves the White House a depressed man.
Inauguration Day, Johnson saw Richard Nixon sworn in, then got on the presidential plane to fly back to Texas. Front door of the plane closed. Johnson pulled out a cigarette, first cigarette he had smoked since his heart attack in 1955. One of his daughters pulled it out of his mouth and said, "Daddy, what are you doing? You're going to kill yourself." He took it back and said, "I've now raised you girls. I've now been president. Now it's my time." From that point on, he went into a very self-destructive spiral.
Without any question, I think he always believed in a fatalistic sort of way that he would die young. And he did. But of course, he helped his own demise and when he went into retirement. He went back to smoking. His belly expanded. He was let his hair grow real long. It was as if he said, "I don't have but maybe a year or so to live, so I'm going to do everything that I want to do."
It's almost like the end of an opera. Johnson's last public appearance was, of all things, a conference on civil rights at the Lyndon Johnson Library in Austin, December of 1972. Johnson not only wanted to call more attention to what he had done in civil rights, but also a lot of the people he invited were black leaders he hadn't spoken to for years, whom he had fallen out with over Vietnam. Johnson was having particularly bad heart pains, and the doctor said, "Do not go." Johnson went anyway. People were shocked. People there thought he looked almost like death itself.
Johnson got up. He slowly climbed the 2 or 3 steps. You could see him popping nitroglycerin pills. He made a speech that was every bit as liberal, every bit as committed to civil rights progress as any of the ones he'd ever made.
We know how much still remains to be done. I'm kind of ashamed of myself that I had 6 years and couldn't do more than I did. But if our efforts continue, and if our will is strong, and if our hearts are right, and if courage remains our constant companion, then, my fellow Americans, I am confident we shall overcome.
They all came together in enormous bear hugs. It was a lovely reconciliation.
It was masterful. Masterful. And he was dead in about a month.
If Johnson hadn't stepped up to the plate on civil rights, these things might have happened later on, but the process would have been uglier, and it would have been much more difficult to bring this country together.
I think the president died very hurt and feeling he would never get credit for what he'd done in civil rights. And I think that he thought he would never be able to receive the kind of credit he felt he deserved for civil rights, not just in his lifetime, but maybe ever.
My grandparents lived in roadside shanties where they were sharecroppers. There were only 2 pictures on the wall, Jesus and Roosevelt. And over time that changed to Martin and Kennedy. I'm not sure Johnson ever ever made the wall.
When he'd go into these houses of Negroes in the South or in the North, and he'd see pictures of John Kennedy up there, it stung.
I must tell you, I think that President Johnson always felt the shadow of this urbane, witty, youthful, handsome, gallant president that hovered over him.
If it hadn't been for Vietnam, President Lyndon Johnson would go down as one of the great presidents because of what he did for civil rights. He just got sidetracked by Vietnam.
I think Johnson was as acute and capable and knowledgeable a politician as we've ever seen in this country. It was because of that enlightened and courageous action taken by Lyndon Johnson that I could be seriously considered in other states outside the South as a possible president. I think he showed great wisdom and benevolence and political courage when he decided to adopt civil rights as a major premise of his presidency.
A lot of people nowadays, I think, see Lyndon Johnson mainly as a president who made big mistakes in Vietnam. I hope what they'll also see in the future is that this is someone who took big risks for civil rights and changed this country in a way that another person as president may not have been able to do.